Hi guys, Anthony Turnham here, and I've got a tutorial for you today all about architectural photography and how to process it. So today we've got a beautiful kitchen here in front of us, and I was there for the joiner to actually photograph this kitchen, but the home itself was so nice that I actually went outside at one point and actually just got a photograph of the home from the exterior, and that is what we're going to be processing today. So that is this shot and this shot. So they were just kind of an afterthought, these photographs here. So like I say, I was actually there predominantly for the joiner, and if we just have a quick look at some of these images of this home, it's a truly stunning, unique and just a gorgeous home. This is the kind of wine cellar I would like. Could spend a fair bit of time in there, right? So anyway, let's take a look at how we're going to process these photos. So these are straight out of camera at the moment. I always shoot a series of 5 images bracketed, middle one, the correct exposure, and then 2 above and 2 below, 1 stop below, 1 stop over. So the first thing we're going to do, let's start working on this image here, and let's see what we want to do with this. I've got all the information that I need, because if we actually grab the exposure and bring it all the way down, we can see in the sky we've got all the detail that we might want for the clouds, and if we bring it all the way up, we've also got all the detail that we want going on in the architecture around here. So it's actually a little noisy, you know, a fair bit of digital grain in there, the noise, which you're going to find when you boost the exposure in the shadows, but it's not enough to bother me. This was shot on the Nikon D800, and so we've got plenty of dynamic range there to work with. So let's dive right in. The first thing I want to look at is make sure that I've got the correct profile assigned to my image here. So if we come down to camera calibration, at the moment we're just on Adobe standard. I actually have pre-made calibrations for the D800, but I'm just going to use camera neutral for this one. It gives us a little more dynamic range, it boosts the shadows and brings down the highlights slightly, so that's a good starting point. I'm just showing you based on camera neutral because you may not have camera profiles for your own camera. If you don't, I seriously recommend that you create some. But anyway, this is a good starting point. So let's look at our exposure and let's bring that up slightly, and we're just going to look at the building itself as our priority. So we can actually boost this up all the way to, say, yeah, around that sort of +2 point. These red marks here are my highlight warnings, which I've got switched on here in the histogram. I can turn them off or on. The same thing we can do with the shadows as well, just by clicking that little arrow triangle up there. That's going to let us know if anything's too dark, and clipping out to black. So let's put that back to kind of where we want that, around there. Let's look at our white balance. I feel we could go a little cooler here. We do have some greys in and around the building here. We can't guarantee that it's pure grey, but we could click that and just see where it puts us. Gives us certainly a nice warm feel to the image. I feel maybe it's got a slight tint going on with the reflection off the grass there, but overall that's okay. It's a tough thing to get the white balance correct when you're shooting at this time of night, because you're actually getting a lot of blue from the sky and also the warm tungsten kind of look from the interior lights, and it's, well, which do you go for? Which is the correct white balance? So that's a bit of a personal preference. You can put that where you want it. Anyway, with architecture, normally I'll find bringing down the highlights a fair bit kind of helps, boosting the shadows so we've got a fair bit of detail in there. It starts to flatten everything out, but we'll look at that in a moment. The white point, we can bring that up even though we're blowing out in the sky. We're going to deal to that in a minute. And the blacks, maybe just bring those down slightly for now. Let's bring the contrast up, give a nice punchy look to this. Yeah, let's go. Actually, I'm going to take the contrast the other way for this, just because if you actually reduce the contrast, you can actually bring out more detail information in the shadows and the highlights, and then you can counteract that by actually increasing the clarity. That will then bring back some localized contrast. So that's quite a nice way to kind of keep a contrasty look and still keep heaps of detail in the architecture itself. So let's go with that for now. Let's bring the blacks up slightly, bring the whites up just a tad, and the shadows maybe just around that 20 mark. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Now it's a little undersaturated at the moment, I feel, so let's give it a little pop of saturation. I say saturation, I prefer using the vibrant slider. I find it gives a more natural look. And we're starting to take shape already. Now let's come and look at our curve. Around the mid-tones, that's where we're sort of at our darkest points. Let's bring those up just slightly. We want to sort of protect those highlights a little bit, but not lose too much of that contrast. And let's actually bring down the bottom part of the curve here just to give it a little more punch. Yep, okay, I'm happy with that for now. Now in the color section, I'm actually going to approach the builder of this home with these images, and I actually spoke with the co-owner, and she'd looked through my portfolio, and I actually really like a nice rich vibrant look that you get during the blue hour after the sun has set and you get all the lights on in the home, similar to this image but a richer blue sky. And she kind of felt that their preference was more towards a more realistic kind of look to the home and the buildings that they create. So I'm actually going to tweak my own style to better suit the client. So although they're not my client yet, I'm actually creating this image to present to them so that hopefully it will appeal to their aesthetic values. So anyway, let's press on with that. See how we've got the yellow inside the property here? I find that is too yellow. I would prefer to see a warmer orange inside there. So sorry, I'm moving the orange slider. Let's grab the yellow slider and actually push the hue towards the orangey red. We don't want to go too far, but I quite like that. It's quite bright. If we bring the luminance down, that starts to balance, I feel, balance the lighting of the interior more with the exterior, which is quite nice. And if we just grab the saturation slider, that's way too much, that's not enough. But what we could do is just bring it down ever so slightly, just so that it's not as saturated in there. You don't want the lighting to look too yellow. Okay, now the grass has been mown and it looks a little patchy to me, and that is something that I would like to deal with. Even though it's not the architecture, everything that surrounds the home has an impact on your perception of that home. So fixing up this grass here, I feel would be better done in Photoshop, because we can individually talk to localized clusters of dry grass, but we could have a go afterwards after we finished our overall adjustments, just seeing if we can address that slightly. But moving on, I kind of feel like that green, the grass is actually just a little too vibrant, so let's just bring the saturation of that down slightly and maybe even just push it towards the yellow. If we push it towards a yellowy orange hue, it actually starts to tie in more with the lighting of the home, but we don't want the grass to look dead. So rather than going this way, we might just take out a little bit of that green tone. Yeah, I think that looks quite nice. I'm going to leave the split toning because that's more of a stylistic thing, and for architectural photography it's not really needed. Detail, I'm just going to leave that for now. One of the most important things when dealing with architectural photography is the lens correction. So the first thing I want to do here is turn on remove chromatic aberration, and that is actually going to get rid of, if there is any, at the side of the lens. Sometimes you get a shift you get a bit of fringing going on. If we remove chromatic aberration, that just takes care of that slight fringing. It's pretty good with this lens, the 16 to 35 millimeter at f8. It seems to be be pretty good. This was shot on a tripod. It was set up in a bit of a rush, to be honest, as like I said, I wasn't there for this photograph. I was actually there for photographing the kitchen, but this was just a little add-on I wanted to grab because the home looked so good. So yeah, done in a little bit of a rush. But anyway, let's remove the chromatic aberration, and let's also enable profile correction. See the difference there? That is just going to stretch out the sides. I say stretch out, it's supposedly correcting any distortion that the lens is naturally giving you. So apparently there's a bit of pin cushioning going on at this focal length, and by pressing that we've supposedly corrected that. Sometimes it can look a little strange if your eye's been so used to looking at the other version. You think, that's not right. But usually that's doing a pretty good job. I'm going to leave distortion and vignetting alone, but now I'm going to come into the manual tab. Sorry, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go into the transform drop down, and I love the guided option that Lightroom introduced a couple of versions back. It's excellent. What you can do is draw two lines down the verticals at either side of the frame, and it will straighten everything out. So click one point, hold and drag, and make sure that that line matches the angle of the side of the building. Does nothing yet, but if we come over and find something over this side of the image which should be straight, so for example this wall with the line of the bricks meeting here, and we drag down there and we let go, all of a sudden everything is straightened out. You can do the same for the horizontals as well. I don't recommend it if you've put a slight turn on your camera. If it's quite a considerable turn, for instance like this, you do not want to go and do this and this, because it's going to distort and stretch over on the right hand side. So although everything is nice and parallel, it just looks really weird. So we're going to undo that, and we're going to leave our horizontal lines just disappearing off into the perspective, which is what you would expect with the camera turned to the right. So now we're looking pretty good, but there's more we can do with this image, and that's where I like to come back and just deal with some localized adjustments. So the first one I would like to do is actually bring down the exposure of the sky. So let's grab a linear gradient and just click and drag down. Now we want a nice smooth transition with this, and you can see already with exposure at minus 0.72 it's starting to bring back the sky. And let's go heavy-handed just so we can see what we're doing. So that's going all the way there, and it starts to bleed over onto the house itself, but it's doing a pretty good job there. That's just dealing with the exposure, but we know that it's in the highlights that all of that information is going on, so we can actually bring the highlights down as well. Now there's two ways that we can deal with the fact that this is going over the building itself. It should be fairly unnoticeable unless you know the gradient is there, because we've feathered it out. However, Lightroom has added a new feature called range mask, and by going to our luminance, which is talking about the brightness of the so with the range mask, what you can do is actually tell Lightroom that you want the filter that you've just put on, whether that's a linear gradient or a radial gradient. You can say to Lightroom, hey, just affect the highlights, or just affect the shadows, or a transition between the two. So if I move this up, see how all of a sudden the shadowy area of the roof of the building is not being affected as I bring that up. So that's and also the trees on the right hand side there, they also do not get that darkening effect anymore. In my opinion, having used this new tool not for a huge amount of time but long enough now, I feel it doesn't do a great job. I find it actually kind of flattens out the look of your image if you're not careful. There's ways around that, but if you bring the range up a little bit, it starts to flatten everything out. But let's say we bring the range there and then adjust the smoothness. That will just kind of feather that out. So it's doing its job pretty well, and hopefully we've got not too much of that effect going over the building itself. Alright, let's draw a gradient from the bottom up as well and darken this foreground. We don't want it done to the extent which it is at the moment, but we do want it to darken it just slightly, just so it leads our eye to the brighter part of the image, which is currently the home. And that looks quite nice. I'd also like to reduce the contrast going on in the grass here. So if we get our contrast slider and just drop that down a fair bit, that also then actually kind of brightened it, so we can put our exposure down a little further. And if we take it away and put it back, yep, that's just helping to lead our eye into the home even more. Let's just reduce the saturation slightly of that grass, and maybe not hit that quite as hard. Okay, I'm kind of liking that. Now what we could do is do a localized radial filter over the home here. Let's pull that over there, reset it to 0 by double clicking, and we could actually just make some fine tuning going on here. Let's boost the exposure just slightly to brighten up the home. The lights in the home are still a bit bright, so let's just drop those highlights slightly. Bring the blacks down so we get a nice punchy rich image. You can see we're only just starting to clip in this top left corner here. Let's just bring that down slightly, and let's play with the clarity. I find the clarity slider works so well for architecture. It's pretty gnarly for portraits and such like, but for architecture, landscapes, the clarity slider works pretty well. It does tend to bring your blacks down a little too hard, so sometimes if you boost the clarity up, you need to adjust that by bringing the blacks back up slightly. That looks great. The only thing I'm finding is that the paving area just here is a little too bright, so let's create another radial filter that we're going to drag up over there just to darken that area slightly. Maybe make that light a little wider there. Okay, now I like that. I would probably deepen the sky, and you could do this in Photoshop and actually get a really good result. In Lightroom we probably don't want to push it too far, but if I grab a radial gradient here, see how the natural curvature of the ellipse kind of works with the frame of the architecture, dropping down here and then coming back up with the trees. So using that adjustment rather than a linear tool, the graduated filter, we can actually just get into the sky there. If we wanted to, we could adjust the color toning of the sky, you know, so bring some of that blue in, which would be quite nice. Reduce the exposure again, and that will just give us a richer color. Maybe we want to bring the contrast up. Oh, we're starting to get the clouds looking a little too dark there. If we do that, we can bring the shadows up to address that though. If you bring the whites up, that actually increases contrast and also saturation. By expanding that contrast, you just naturally sort of introduce more saturation. You could do that with the sky. I'm thinking, because I am doing this for this builder and they said they prefer a more natural look, I am actually just going to delete that adjustment that I just made and leave it exactly as that. The final touch I'd like to make is just to crop this in. I find that a more panoramic crop tends to work nicely for architecture. We don't need to see all of that sky. We certainly don't need to see all of this grass. So by cropping in there, we're going to get a much nicer look to this image, I feel. And it's more just about the architecture. So we get a lovely lead-in line coming from the corner here all the way up and in. The grasses on this side lead us into the architecture, and we've basically used the rule of thirds, where the main building, the architecture itself, falls within that center third. Running across there, the top third is the sky, the bottom third is the foreground and the grass. The main part of the home falls on this intersection of thirds, and the other component of the home falls on this third. So I actually think that's quite a nice crop. There's another alternative we could do, which is to crop in here and actually lose what I think is pretty ugly parasol cover. We could go for something like that. Personally, I quite like seeing more of the trees and giving it more of an environmental look. Just sets it into its own environment quite nicely. And we're going to turn these warnings off and just have a check we're happy with how all our sliders are. Might be able to just have a little tweak here to just add a bit more contrast in here now. And let's just reset all the settings on that virtual copy. So now we can flick between the two so we can see our before here and our after. So we've got a before and an after. And now we have our after and we compare it with our before. I just feel that maybe the exposure is a little too bright. So let's just bring our exposure back down. After all, it was shot at in the evening. Yeah, I feel like that might be a nicer place to sit with this. Yep. So we have our before and we have our after. Thanks for watching, guys. If you'd like to see more tutorials, please let me know in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like, give me some love, and I'll keep going, bringing out content like this. If there's anything particular you would like to know with regards to post-production or photography, again, leave me a comment. I'd love to know some ideas of things people are wanting to learn about, and I'm happy to help. I've been photographing a wide variety of photography for a long time now, from architecture, landscapes, weddings, portraiture, product photography, you name it, I've photographed it. I worked for some big clients, so please tap into my knowledge base, subscribe up and like up. Cheers guys, I'll catch you in another video. Bye for now.